Hello, I'm Mark Payne with the West Virginia Humanities Council. Welcome to History Alive. History Alive is a program of the Humanities Council that brings historical figures to life through first-person portrayals by presenters who have conducted thorough research into their character. The Humanities Council makes these characters available to both nonprofit and for-profit organizations across West Virginia. History Live is designed as an interactive experience between the character and the audience. They're entertaining and educational. We encourage your organization, school, or event to host a presentation and bring a figure from history for a visit with your audience or students. Having someone like Harriet Tubman or Stonewall Jackson come to speak to your group can breathe life into these historical figures. Nothing compares to the live, in-person visit. Each presentation consists of 3 parts: a monologue, a question-answer session with the character, and then the presenter breaks character to answer questions about how he or she conducted their research. Our History Live presenters have researched a variety of sources such as diaries, journals, letters, official documents, autobiographies, and the research of other scholars in developing their character. A History Live presentation is not a play. It's an audience participation event that relies on interaction between the audience and the character. Being able to ask your own questions of these important figures from the past is a unique experience. It's difficult to reproduce the feel of an actual History Live presentation here in the studio. Without an audience to ask questions, we will change the format a bit and have our guests sit with me for a few questions after their monologue. But we hope to give a sample of how a History Live presentation can add to your program offerings. There will be information on the screen at the end of this program for how to contact the Humanities Council about bringing a History Alive character to your community. At this time, I would like to welcome today's guest from history. We are pleased to have with us in the studio, Gabriel Arthur.
Hail all here. My master, Major General Abraham Wood, the worthy commandant of Fort Henry at the falls of the Appomattox River, since its construction 28 years ago in the year of our Lord 1646, has sent me to you to reveal to you the recent discoveries made possible by my master's personal investment. Discoveries that will no doubt lead to the increase of wealth of other worthy investors who seize upon the opportunities that these discoveries now present, opportunities of which I will now make you aware. I am called Gabriel Arthur, and I am humbled at your interest in my master's enterprise. Encouragements by our great king and many noblemen, the Virginia House of Burgesses, the Virginia Council, and of late the gentlemen investors of the Carolina Company, have spurred Master Wood to westward endeavors that will soon lead us away to the Indian Ocean and the riches of the Orient, as well as to the abundance of furs in the mountains that lie just a few days' travel to the westward of Fort Henry. Perhaps you may recall the verse that was penned a couple of years ago regarding the heightened interest in the fur trade. I think I can remember some lines of that verse. Let me ponder for a moment. Yes, here's the crux of the matter. Friend, once 'twas fame that led thee forth to brave the tropic heat, the frozen north. Late it was gold, and then beauty was the spur. But now our gallants venture but for furs. My master, he very early on realized the great potential for expanding the fur trade with the Western Indians. Misters Batt and Fallon were sent by him to a journey of discovery where they found, first time ever, Western waters draining into the Oriental Sea. My master's strong friendships with the several Indian towns and nations, especially with the people of Appomattox town, have resulted in a timely provision of guides, able guides like Paracute, who guided Misters Batt and Fallon, as well as with hawk-eyed hunters who provide plenty of venison and wild fruits to sustain my master's parties of discovery. Indeed, when Master Wood decided to send me in the company of Mr. Needham, Appomattox Indians were our guides. They are very familiar with the paths to Saponi Town, Totara Town, and beyond. And they also are able to provide us with language resources that we need sometimes when we are exchanging with new peoples that we come along. We had no trouble to note, of course, in the days that we began to put our gear together. I will tell you, we packed for our bread rockahominy, That is the dried, grounded Indian cornmeal that has ever sustained our Indian neighbors. The finer meals of wheat and rye, they often mold in the moistness of the air, and so no biscuit did we pack. For our meat, we filled our wallets with venison jerk, and we had expectation of occasion for fresh flesh provided by our hunters. We left the 10th of April in 73, and we packed lots of items to take, carried upon the backs of horses, including shot, powder, hatchets, which the Indians call tomahawks. And these items we made up along with kettles, Duffields, Stroudwater blankets, red and blue plains, and other items into these packs. Each one was a load of about 150 to 200 pounds, carried upon the backs of horses. They may travel about 20 miles a day with such packs if forage happened to be plentiful. And as we moved out, we had no trouble to speak of except from the Occaneechees. When we came to their town, they stopped up our way. Formerly, they were steadfast trading partners of my master, but of late, they have become jealous of his enterprise, and they wish to remain in the middle of the trading path, intent on taking what they will from the Western Indians who wish to trade with my master. But by and by, we gained our passage through Occaneechee town. We traveled south and by west 9 days' journey from Occaneechee to Citaree, crossing 9 rivers and creeks, all of which empty themselves eastward into the East Sea, the Atlantic Ocean. At Citaree, we left all but one horse, it being the last town of inhabitants and not any path further for 13 days' journey towards the sun setting until we came to within 2 days' journey of the Tamahitan town. We passed the Great Blue Ridge and 5 rivers, all of which empty themselves northwest, until we came to the river of the Tamahitans, which seems to flow more westerly than the other 5 rivers. When we arrived at Tamahita town, the inhabitants made much of our horse, and of us, being the first Englishmen to ever set foot and walk upon the streets of their town. After some days of refreshment and curious amusements, Mr. Needham and I decided that he and Pericute should return with messages for my master, and that I should remain and learn the Tamahitan tongue. The Tamahitan king, he became attached to me, or rather I to him, ever after he acted the hand of God and preserved my life from certain death at the hands of friends of the Occaneechees living there at Tamahita town. I learned much from the Tamahitans. They call themselves Tsoyaha, rendered into English, that is, children of the sun. Ever since the Spaniards barbarously treated 20 Tamahitans who went to trade with them, murdering 18, they put to death every white and black Spaniard that they take. The king, whose name is Kipahagwa, he promised to go with me to Fort Henry in the spring, and then he made plans for martial forays against his enemies. He insisted I go with him, and he gave me this clamshell, stungane, to carry with me on my journeys. It is verily useful as an eating bowl, a drinking cup, a paint mixing pot, a hand spade, and a scoop. I have ever carried it with me since. We engaged in 2 attacks, one against the Spaniards near the South Sea, and one against enemy Indians near Port Royal in Carolina. But those tales can wait for another day. After we return from our campaigns, Kipahagwa must go and give a visit to the Monitans, which are his friends. Moni signifies water, and Itani, great in their language, thus in English, grape water. We got off with 60 men, and we traveled due north 10 days, passing several ridges and the valleys that run along them, and then we came and climbed a very great flat-topped mountain and descended northward along a creek like unto a small river. When we came to a very great river at the effluent of the creek, we turned our faces downstream, and we passed numerous earthen mounds set there by the ancients who once resided in that great river's valley. We arrived at Moniton town, situated on the north bank of that great river. That river is the same which Messrs. Batt and Fallon were upon 3 years ago. It is the river that many Virginians have begun to call Woods River, after my master, although my master primarily refers to it as the New River. That river flows to the northwest, and out of its western side goeth another very great river, which the Monitans call Mosopelea Taxita. The inhabitants there are an innumerable company of Indians, and the extent of their habitations are 20 days' journey from one end to the other, and all are at war with the Monitans. At Moniton Town, where the New River is, the river itself sometimes causes freshes to arise above the lower river terrace. And that river terrace, then, is a very high nutriment soil that provides a wonderful place for gardening. Numerous melons, Indian corn, squashes, and pulses of various sorts are grown there in great abundance. The river itself provides great stores of fishes and clams in season to the Monitans, and the surrounding hills supply game, abundance of turkeys, deer, elks, bear, wolf, and other smaller vermin. Upon the slashes grow great canes, although not so great as those amongst the Tamahitans. The river is fresh, and the Monitans did so often swim and bathe in it that I braved it sometimes myself, seeing that no harm had come to the Monitans for doing so. Indeed, I enjoyed the refreshment of the river so greatly that upon my return to Fort Henry, I have, at sundry times when my masters granted me idle, taken a dip in the Appomattox River. I doubt not that I am the only Englishman who has done so, but I have not become ill from that. After we had some days of refreshment with the Monitans, we decided to go beyond the New River to that westerly flowing effluent, which I told you the Monitans call Mosopelea Taxita, named after the people who reside there, the Monitans call the Mosopeleans. We marched 3 days out of our journey, and we gave a clap to some of that great nation that lives on that water. Kipahagwa put me in arms. He gave me my gun back. He gave me a knife, tomahawk, and a target. But he did not require that I cut my hair as the Moniton men do, and the Tamaitan men do. They keep their hair close cut so that an enemy may not design to take a hold of them by it. And so we fell courageously upon the Mosopeleans when we attacked them, and we were courageously repulsed by them. Suddenly, a pain I felt in my arm here, where an arrow hit my flesh. There is still a scar there that proves it. It is shallow flesh, and so the arrow, upon hitting my bone, fell out. We advanced a number of times towards the Mosopeleans, and we reversed our advance backwards from the Mosopeleans, and then suddenly a hail of arrows, greater than I have ever seen, came from the sky. One of the arrows found its way to the flesh of my thigh and pierced all the way through, crippling me. I stumbled to the ground, and I could not retreat. And then I was made a prisoner. I thought then that being captivated in a strange land, amongst strange people, I might never again see the face of an Englishman. But by God's providence and protection, I was restored, and I look upon your English faces here and I smile. My master, he has taught me well to treat the trading engines with great respect. And so, even though the Mosopeleans had made me prisoner, when they turned me over to the virgins who stripped me down and took me to Mosopelea Taxita and scoured my skin with ashes and water, they found that I was white. And they admired at that fact. They pondered why my skin was so pale, and they wished to obtain the metal goods that I had that they had taken from me. And so, by and by, I was able to return by the good graces of God and by the assistance of the Mosopeleans. They carried me on a litter to the path that leads towards the Tamaitan town. And by Kipahagwa kept his promise and returned me to Fort Henry, where I have been ever since, planning for the next journey westward. My master was glad to hear that I had found 3 great nations of Indians on the western waters beyond Pemotink, who were willing to trade with him and exchanged their furs for his goods. And now I will be glad to answer should you have any questions regarding the great new discoveries and your potential trading partners west of Paymotink, that great crest of mountains that divides the waters of this continent.
I'm here with Gabriel Arthur, and Mr. Arthur, I appreciate you being here with us today.
Glad to be here.
When you spoke a few minutes ago, you had mentioned your master, Abraham Wood. I'd like to ask you, how did that relationship begin for you with Abraham Wood?
Well, Master Wood is my master by way of my indentured servitude towards him. I've been indentured to him for a number of years, and I still have a few more years of my indenture to go, and he's taught me many things. So the indenture allows me to learn from my master, and it allows my master to have the services of the indenture.
Okay.
Myself.
Now, you left on your expedition for Abraham Wood with a group of people, and I'm curious about what was the size, if you can remember, of
I believe there were 20 or 21, 22, and most were indentures of Master Wood, but there were also some gentlemen. Mr. Needham was the leader of the expedition, and we had several Appomattox engines with us, and along the way we picked up one or two Occanechian engines as well.
Okay, and that included, or you also had horses with you.
We had horses
as well to carry supplies.
Yes, my recollection was we had 18 horses with us.
And you left Fort Henry, which in the state of Virginia, and worked.
Well, Virginia is not a state, sir.
Oh, I'm sorry. The
colony of Virginia.
Right, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out to me. What I wanted to ask you is, you were going in large part in search of furs and to trade with the Indians.
Oh, yes.
What prompted this the interest in furs?
Oh, well, here, let me show you. Here are some furs that I brought. These are beaver furs. These are buck beaver furs. They bring the highest price. These were taken in the wintertime. Taken in the summer, they're not worth much.
Yeah.
But the beaver hat in Europe has become quite the fashion. And so the soft under fur, which we call the wool or the down of the beaver, is needed to felt into hats, similar to this hat, only made of the beaver fur as opposed to the sheep fur, which is what my hat is made of. And so these furs one time were supplied by Russia, and now Russia has run out of beaver furs because of trapping. So the North American continent is the place to be if you're anybody who's going to have anything whatsoever to do with the fur industry.
Is it primarily the beaver that people are interested in?
Absolutely. Otter is somewhat useful, but there is nothing like the beaver wool for turning water from your head.
Ah, that makes sense when you think about it.
This is, it's a water animal. And what would happen if the fur could not turn the water from the animal? The animal would be waterlogged and soggy. And there are plenty of these to the west. Plenty to the west. There used to be many more around the Appomattox River, but sadly they are gone, all trapped out because of the fur trade.
So when you left on your expedition, what guided you? Did you have maps, or were you making maps as you went?
To begin our plans, we had the map from Mr. Lederer, which was provided to us as a copy from Governor Berkeley. But Mr. Lederer's map only goes to the base of the mountains, not beyond the mountains, or Paymotink, as those Indians call those great mountains. Paymotink. We call the Blue Ridge. The Spaniards call the Appalachian or the Shawala Mountains. We had no maps beyond the foot of the Great Blue Ridge. And so we had to depend upon our Appomattox guides to get us beyond that point. And we fell in with some Tamahitans. And those are the people who led us to their town way beyond the mountains.
Now, you were also, while on your journey, taken prisoner.
Yes.
For a period of time.
Yes.
And you were taken prisoner by the Mosopalaeans?
Yes, I was taken prisoner by the Mosopalaeans. That is what the Monitons call them. And they...
How were you treated during that period of time?
Well, initially, as I mentioned when I was talking to the people earlier, I was handed over to the virgins, the young women of the town, and they took me into the water, which the Monitans call Mosopelea Taxita, a great river, beyond the new river that Master Wood and Betts and Fallon had discovered. They took me to that water and they scoured my skin there, so that was rough treatment. But when they found that my skin was white, then they made very much of me, and they admired at my gun and my knife and my tomahawk. And so they treated me well. I reached my tomahawk, which I have here, I reached it to the Moniton king. And I spake to him or the Mosopelayan king, and I spake to him in the Moniton language, and I said, Witahe, he tip mingistoi, yingitoi, tried to give him the tomahawk. He didn't understand my language, but eventually I gave it to him as a gift. And they treated me very well after that, for they had not any manner of iron instrument amongst them that I saw, none whatsoever. This was a powerful thing. And I hope by giving these metal gifts to the Mosopelayans that they would be secured to my master's trade.
Well, at this point, I'd like to point out that this isn't really Gabriel Arthur. This is really Doug Wood, who is has a long time member of our History Live roster, and we're very glad that you are, Doug.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here with us today.
Thanks for the opportunity.
I know that you have you also portray Ostinako on our roster and have done so for a long while. So I'm gonna start by asking you, Doug, how did you come to learn about Gabriel Arthur? What was it that interested you?
The first time that I recall ever learning about Gabriel Arthur, I was doing some research in the Cultural Center Archives Library, and I was given a book by authors' last names Bidgood and Alvord about explorations, the first explorations in the Trans-Allegheny region by the Virginians. And in that was a letter from Abraham Wood to his factor back in England, a fellow whose name I don't recall at the moment, but that letter described this journey that this fellow, Gabriel Arthur, had made. And for a long time, historians weren't really sure where he ended up. But through the use of archaeological evidence and through modern historians who had more access to other materials that the earlier historians, Bidgood and Albert, had, brought us all to the conclusion that he was in the Kanawha Valley. And that really piqued my interest because that made him the first recorded European into the Kanawha Valley. The year was 1674 when he came into the Kanawha Valley. So it was that library just happened upon a book that told me that story, and then later research made me realize that indeed he had been in the Kanawha Valley.
Yeah. Do you have an idea of how old of a man he was at that time?
I don't for sure. Bidgood and Alvord conjectured that he was probably a young man, maybe around the 18, but there's no documentary evidence to really support that. But that would have been a typical age for an indenture. The indentures would run from some of them as short as 5 years, although that was unusual, usually 10 years or more. The folks were indentured. So probably the middle part of his life would be the time that he was indentured, or the early part of the middle part of his life. Folks didn't live as long as we do today, back then.
Now, and you just pointed out that Gabriel Arthur is understood to be the first European American white person to see the Kanawha Valley. And could you talk a little bit about the range and the scope of that expedition that he set on, and how he ended up getting to southern West Virginia and the Kanawha Valley? And
I might want to mention that many people think that Betts and Fallon, who were sent by Wood just 2 years prior to Arthur, made it to the Kanawha Valley, but the evidence is that they did not. They were on the headwaters of the New River, possibly, and then possibly on the Big Sandy and the Gandat River as well, but probably not into the Kanawha Valley. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Okay.
But Arthur's trip took him from where Petersburg, Virginia is today, that's where Fort Henry was, across the Appalachian Mountains, the Blue Ridge and the Appalachian Mountains, to eastern Tennessee somewhere, where the Tamahitan town was. Tamahitans, we now know, were Yuchi people. They eventually moved to the Chattahoochee River, but at that time they were living in probably in East Tennessee. Then he went from East Tennessee on an expedition with Kipahagwa to near the Gulf Coast, fighting the Spaniards, probably in Alabama or Georgia. We're not exactly sure where. And then he went back to East Tennessee, and then he went to Port Royal, South Carolina, which is near Charleston. Actually, near, I think I mentioned another name earlier, but it was near Charleston. And then he went back to East Tennessee, and from that point, they struck due north, as Wood said, and that puts them into the Kanawha Valley after 10 days of travel, 10 days, each day being approximately 20 miles or so. That puts them into the Kanawha Valley. So they indeed had to climb a flat top mountain. There were a number of Indian trails that we now know of because of archaeological evidence that went from the southern area across the mountains of southern West Virginia into the Kanawha Valley.
So when you say flat top mountain, are you talking about?
Yeah, that's the same mountain, Flat Top Mountain, where Winter Place is today, where Beckley and Oak Hill, they're all upon the great Flat Top Mountain there. A very noticeable landscape feature for anyone who would have traveled across it. And Arthur mentioned in the monologue, I believe, he mentioned great mounds, or did I get to that point?
I don't think so.
No. In my full monologue, he talks a little bit about the great mounds in the Kanawha Valley to help people better understand in the character of Arthur where he is located. Because as we know, we still have 3 mounds within the Kanawha Valley, and there were many more at one time.
Right.
So,
but he did see those, and
he would have seen those mounds. He didn't document them, but he would have seen those mounds, and he traveled downstream to the mouth of the Kanawha. Moniton Town was one of the towns existing in the Kanawha Valley in the late 1600s. Not exactly sure which one, but it was described as being one day's journey from what we now call the Ohio River, and that would put it at around Buffalo if we count the 20 miles by foot as the travel that was mentioned. So he would have been at the mouth of the Kanawha in one day, and then 2 days downstream to battle the Mosopalaeans. So 1 day to the mouth of the Kanawha, 2 days down the Ohio to battle the Mosopalaeans, probably would put him beyond the Portsmouth area, but close to the Portsmouth area. And then he went back to East Tennessee, and then he finally returned to the Falls of the Appomattox. So we're talking 1,000+ miles.
But he ultimately returned to Fort Henry.
Absolutely.
So the expedition was
It was a success. It was a very good success. It happened at a time that didn't allow it to bloom fully into the fur exchange that Wood had hoped about because of a rebellion that occurred, Bacon's Rebellion. But it certainly held great promise right at that instant in history, because he had indeed contacted 3 new nations of Indians, new to Abraham Wood, who had abundance of beaver furs that they could exchange to Wood for the English manufactured products.
Well, here in the last 30 seconds that we have, Doug, do we know whatever happened to Gabriel?
We don't.
Arthur?
The documentary evidence is very poor about Gabriel's life, and which is another bit of evidence that he probably was an indentured servant and never struck it big on the stage of history, so to speak. So we don't really know what happened to Gabriel Arthur after he returned.
Okay. Well, Doug, again, I'd like to thank you, Doug Wood, for being here, and we'd like to thank you for tuning in to History Alive.